Harryville and Ballymena in the north has been picketed by Orange men. They say they're staging this protest because the Orange lodges have been prevented from marching through the nearby village of Dunloy. It's a microcosm of the nightmare that the marching season poses for community relations up there. On Easter Monday, the marching season is due to get going once again in earnest, and there's obvious concern that the violence witnessed last year will be repeated once again in 1997. Tonight, we reveal for the first time evidence that Sinn Féin infiltrated many of the nationalist residents' associations and were responsible for orchestrating much of the protest. This report from Justin O'Brien.
5 p.m. and the armoured Land Rovers begin to file out of Ballymena RUC station in a ritual which has now gone on for 26 weeks. Local officers are supported by mobile support units drawn from across the north. The policing of the Harryville protest is estimated to have cost at least £1.25 million already. And as the marching season approaches, the strain on resources is likely to increase significantly. As night falls, the parishioners of Harryville file into the heavily fortified chapel. Loyalist protesters begin to converge across the road. The area is overwhelmingly Protestant, overwhelmingly disaffected. The protest will stop only when the Orange Order can march through the nearby village of Dunloy. There's no attempt to enter a dialogue. Intimidation is the order of the day. The Catholics of Harryville are being held to ransom over an issue they have no control over by a Protestant community no longer sure of itself.
This is a community, screaming out for help in a situation where they feel, as a whole community, extremely beleaguered politically at this time. I suppose they too recognise or believe that there is political power available in a situation like that, and we've seen that over the last couple of years, all in relation to parades, that there is power in street politics, but it's a very dangerous form of power. It can't be easily turned on and turned off again, or let's say it's not as easy to turn off as it is to turn on.
Primetime has made contact with the secretive grouping. A representative agreed to be interviewed only on condition of anonymity. He said this was not because he doubted the validity of his case, but in order to protect himself from possible retaliation from the Republican movement.
The protest has been designed purely to highlight the fact that some of our community were denied the right to attend their place of worship by Republicans in Dunloy.
But there's a difference between Republicans in Dunloy and the Catholic community in general in Ballymena.
No, well, I think we've all got our sides of the fences. Now, the Catholic people are in the middle of Harryville, a strong Protestant Loyalist area, which contrasts with Dunloy being a strong Catholic Republican area. So the right should be for each to attend their place of worship.
The protest here has at times degenerated into violence. The use of the beleaguered parishioners of Harryville as a pressure point to wrest concessions from Dunloy may be viewed with distaste by many within the Protestant community at large, but the protesters have shown they can draw on the support of a wider constituency, such as at this band parade outside the chapel 3 weeks ago. Calls by the Orange Order leadership in Belfast and local unionist politicians like the mayor to stop the protest have been drowned out by the beating of the tribal drum.
These representatives or politicians, they haven't come onto the ground and gathered the feeling of the people in Harryville. They have spoken either from their homes or their party headquarters. They haven't come and talked to the people of Harryville.
Do you think that your community is one under threat?
When you say my community, do you mean the Protestant people?
Yeah.
Yes. We have seen erosion of Protestant liberty in this land, which has now been jumped on. And every week there is a recall from Sinn Féin IRA for a further erosion of those.
The failure of the Dunloy Orange Lodge to breach the police lines in the isolated village has created a running sore which is infecting all of North Antrim. The local lodge had distanced itself from the protest in Harryville, but in a change of strategy, its spokesman is now prepared to share a platform with the men in the shadows.
But because 100 protesters, many of whom were not from Dunloy, stood at the corner, the RUC were unwilling to push them back. And one has to take a comparison between that and Harryville, where we have 70 and 80 Land Rovers of police brought in to allow Roman Catholics to go to Mass. They have not been denied going to Mass. They've always been allowed to go. The protesters are not there to deny them their rights. They're just making a simple protest. The Orange men in Dunloy have not been allowed their civil and religious liberty. And I think it's a disgrace for the Chief Constable to say on one hand, yes, Roman Catholics in Harryville must be allowed to go to church, and I agree with that. But it must be a disgrace that he cannot say, on the other hand, the Orange men that have been in Dunloy for 100 years cannot get to their place of worship.
The implications of this rage are profound. Pauline Gilmore is at the forefront of attempts to organise opposition to what is seen as a concerted attack on Protestant values. She recognises that the Harryville protest may be misguided, but can understand what's fueling it.
What keeps them going is the principles and the ideas they started off in the first place, and that is sheer frustration and disgust and anger at how Protestants and the Orange Order, the Black Preceptory, Apprentice Boys and Protestant civil rights is portrayed in Northern Ireland and how it's acted upon. They feel very much that the government has turned to a nationalist agenda, that they have left the Protestant community very much pushed into their enclaves and pushed into their backs up against the wall situation. That's what keeps it going, that's what keeps it angry, that's what keeps it bitter. And sadly, our Protestant politicians are not listening to what these people are saying. They're not going to go away, they're going to stay at Harryville, they're going to stay in the streets until they feel that the issue is addressed properly and that the Dunloy Orange men get down through the street to get to their church.
The Harryville protest is in effect a crude reflection of the Sinn Féin strategy. What it lacks in the sophisticated PR operation, it makes up for in steely resolve. The breakdown in law and order in the face of unionist rage across the north last year was a direct result of Sinn Féin's policy of organising residents' committees from Derry to Newry, from Roslay to Belfast Ormer Road to oppose the right to march. The only winner was Sinn Féin, as Gerry Adams himself made clear in a private speech to party officials in Athboy last November, obtained by prime time. Asked any activist in the north did Drumcree happen by accident, the Sinn Féin president said, and they'll tell you no. 3 years of work in the Lower Ormer Road, Portadown, in parts of Fermanagh and Newry, Armagh and in Balahy and up in Derry. 3 years' work went into creating that situation, and fair play to those people who put the work in. And he concluded that these are the type of scene changes that we have to focus in on and develop and exploit. Cold political reality is buffeting the nationalist community in the north as it considers the consequences of a repeat of last year's tribal outburst. Sean Farren is a North Antrim representative of the SDLP. He argues that Sinn Féin could be bringing the north to the brink of civil war.
If that is their intention, then to some extent it could be said that they have succeeded. But the price of that is the spread of tension, the deepening of divisions, and in fact the hardening of attitudes. And it removes the flexibility and the possibility for the kind of accommodation that is necessary right across the north, whether at local level or more generally, to arrive at a situation whereby we can all work together within new political institutions to improve and to address the situation.
The marching season will begin in earnest here on Belfast Ormer Road on Easter Monday. The refusal by the police to allow an apprentice boy parade to pass over the bridge last year resulted in serious violence and set the precedent for the summer of chaos which followed it. The paradox is that despite an awareness of the Sinn Féin strategy, at this stage neither the unionist politicians nor the loyal institutions are prepared to take the risks necessary to break free from the trap so carefully set. Gerry Adams is again stepping up the ante, somewhat mischievously calling on the Irish government to send in observers during a morale-boosting visit last week to Gerard Rice of the Lower Ormer Road Concerned community. Dublin, no doubt aware of the cynicism, has opted not to comment publicly, but the presence in the capital later that day of Gerard Rice and his compatriots from the Garvaghey Road and the Bogside being feted by the Tornista cannot have soothed fears in the Protestant north. After 6 months running the gauntlet at Harryville, there is no sign of a way out for the parishioners, or indeed for the police or the protesters. Concern is rising that if the demonstration continues into the marching season, it will take on an even more sinister character. Politics in the north is going through a treacherous period.
Things are very serious. We have seen our Protestantism, our culture eroded. People where they're in the minority, they certainly feel under threat. And Republicans are turning on the heat by shooting, bombing. We feel it's only a matter of time before this goes province-wide. Yes, it is serious.
Despite appearances, the machismo of the Harryville protest is in effect a cloak for the increasing impotence of a tradition which has been seriously undermined and outmanoeuvred by the machinations of Sinn Féin. In the process, it's becoming more and more unstable, something we ignore at our peril.
That report from Justin O'Brien. I'm joined now by the SDLP's Mark Durgan, who is in Derry. Mark Durgan, were you surprised by what Gerry Adams said at Athboy?
No, if he said it, I'm not surprised by it. I said it to your own reporter in the course of last summer when he was reporting on events in Derry and elsewhere, that the situation clearly was being exploited, and I differentiated the sort of role we in the SDLP were trying to play in terms of trying to avoid problems and solve problems, and those of others who were simply exacerbating or exploiting problems.
I mean, when you say exploit and orchestrate, are you saying, obviously the grievances exist anyway, and obviously many nationalists do not like these marches taking place in their areas, so you're saying Sinn Féin are doing just to promote their own image, to give them something to do?
Well, first of all, I think we need to be careful not to reroute the issue into simply the question of who is exploiting what. The fact is there are very real issues and sensitivities there that need to be addressed. And those issues are issues that are going to come to the fore regardless of whether any party tries to take a particular stance or make particular party profit out of the situations or not. Those are issues that have to be there and addressed and appraised and that need dialogue. And so the issue can't be rerouted in that sense. But clearly, all of us have a contribution to make. All of us need to look at what our input was last year. And if we want to have a different outcome to the marching season, then we clearly need to change and see if we can make different contributions. And parties last year, unionist parties, clearly exacerbated the situation, and there is evidence that Sinn Féin did exploit the situation, because after all, during the summer, during some of the marching issues, they were saying they weren't involved in some of these groups, they weren't involved in stoking up the situation, but afterwards they were claiming credit for having done so, and were given credit by the media for having done so, and didn't resile from those media compliments.
You know many of these residents' associations. Do they not realise that if, for instance, the unionists can label it and say it's being orchestrated and run by Sinn Féin, they can use that to refuse to negotiate with them? Isn't it a weakness for them?
Well, I think that's one of the difficulties. As I say, that makes it easier for people to try to reroute the issue and avoid the issue. And they can't. I mean, any more than those of us who can point out that there are some pretty strange characters involved in some of the lodges and some of the untoward activity of some of the lodges. That doesn't mean that we can avoid having to take on board that there are some valid concerns and there are rights on the part of the unionist community and those orders who wish to march. We can use all sorts of evidence against each other to try to dismiss each other. What we know is dismissing each other and avoiding each other doesn't give us a solution. We need dialogue. And if unionists really do believe that this situation all is a Sinn Féin put up, then they can change that by changing the script. They don't have to perform to the script by refusing to negotiate it and go on the way they are. They can change the script by entering into dialogue.
Mark Durgan, thank you very much for joining us. I'm joined now from London by the leader of the Ulster Unionists, David Trimble. Mr. Trimble, you heard that report there. Obviously, there are many genuine residents in these areas who are very unhappy about these marches. Will they use this as a reason not to negotiate?
Well,
your report, I think, has been very valuable. It has confirmed what we knew. It's not a surprise. It's confirmed. It's confirmed not just that, as Mark Durkin seems to think, that Sinn Féin are exploiting the issue. As Mr. Adams said, it took 3 years hard work for them to create the issue. And I think that is the word that one has to bear in mind, to create the issue. We have known this to be the case. And that is why it is so difficult for there to be the sort of dialogue and the sort of give and take that should be used to resolve the situation, because we're dealing with people who are not interested in any sort of give and take.
But isn't the problem also, Mr. Trimble, that for generations these marches have upset many nationalists, and that for you yourself last year you didn't exactly help the situation? So by not negotiating with the residents' associations, doesn't it all become worse? Should you encourage people to negotiate?
But Miriam, you're quite wrong, of course. You are quite wrong on the facts. As to the marches do not deliberately go where they're not wanted. There are no marches. That? Sorry.
They go through areas the residents don't want them, Mr.
Sorry,
Trimble.
I think you should allow me to speak. I think it's traditional in interviews to let the interviewee speak. Now, marches aren't deliberately planned to go where they're not wanted. There are no marches by Orangemen on the Falls Road. We have problems due to changes, and indeed in my own area, due to ethnic cleansing by Republicans of what was originally a Unionist area. Now that creates problems. Of course, it's bound to create problems.
Does there need to be compromise?
There has been. If you again come to the area that you were referring to, 10 years ago, there were 8, I think actually, Orange walks to church and other walks on more formal Orange parades in the area. Now there's only one, and there's been compromise as to the manner in which it proceeds.
But
indeed, actually, if you were to look at the code of conduct that is proposed in the North Report, and take that code of conduct and set it beside the activities of Portadown Orangemen, you'd find that they're completely in compliance with the proposed code of conduct.
So you support the North Report. Do you support the North Report's findings?
I'm referring to the code of conduct that is proposed.
Not the independent
pointing out
body.
to you, well, our position on that is well known, and I'm sure you're aware of it. Pointing out that Portadown Orangemen are actually in compliance with it, but the so-called residents group there is not. And that's an interesting contrast.
We focused on Harryville, and obviously as a unionist leader, what you say is very important to the people who support you. Is the picket at Harryville wrong?
Well, I've already said that on a number of occasions. I'm sure you're aware of that too. And you'll have noticed the way in which the Ulster Unionist mayor of Ballymena, supported by his councillors, has made clear the feelings of so many. I understand the frustration of the people who are mounting that picket. I understand their frustration, but we've said to them that this isn't the best way to do things, and that they would be better to express their views in other ways, because they who stand and who support the concept of civil and religious liberty cannot lend themselves to an attempt to deny it to other people. It's the simple business of two wrongs not making a right.
The way you understand that, do you also understand how some nationalists find the parades upsetting?
Well, I think this is something that is well worth looking at. I mean, what is upsetting about the concept of people walking to and from churches? Actually, I wonder if your viewers realise that a church service, an Orange service, is not the same as an Orange parade. It's not an Orange parade because we don't have banners, and the bands are limited, and they're playing hymn tunes, and there will be a limit on for example, the number of flags that are carried. I mean, the Drumcree Church parade that people talk about, one Union Jack, only one, is flown with regard to that. This isn't a triumphalist parade, and I think people should appreciate the nuances that exist here.
But do you also appreciate, I mean, it's difficult if one doesn't live up there, but they perceive those marches as sectarian and triumphalist, and perhaps there's a service at the end of it, but there's a parade in the middle.
The triumphalism is coming from a different quarter. I think that's again something where a closer regard and a more scrupulous regard to the facts would actually be appropriate. The triumphalism is coming from one area. The ethnic cleansing is coming from one area too.
But don't both sides, Mr. Trimble, perceive it to be against themselves? Isn't that the problem? And therefore, as a leader, shouldn't you encourage compromise and negotiation?
There is perception and there is reality, and I think one shouldn't simply reinforce perceptions that don't correspond entirely to reality. I think that's something that your mindless support for anti-Orange activities is likely to do.
Okay, David Trimble, thank you very much for joining us from London. I'm now joined from Derry by Sinn Féin's Mitchell McLaughlin. Mitchell McLaughlin, to quote, 3 years' work went into creating that situation, and fair play to those people who put the work in. Why did Gerry Adams say that?
Well, I think Gerry Adams was validating the very hard work of the many residents groups. I think it was a fair comment, and I think they do deserve a considerable amount of credit.
But he was implying that you had provoked the situation. Ask any activists in the North, did Drumcree happen by accident? And they will tell you no. Are you trying to say you orchestrated Drumcree?
No, you said it, and I would refute that.
Your leader said it.
No, he didn't. Read the remarks. What he did was he made very clear recognition and validation of the very hard work done on the ground by a whole range of residents groups. Gerry Adams didn't invent, Sinn Féin didn't invent nationalist resentment of triumphalist or supremacist orange marchers. It is a fact of history and reality in the North.
But are you exploiting that for your own ends?
Sinn Féin represents 43% on the last count, even before the last edition of Drumcree. 43%. There's not a nationalist community in the north of Ireland that doesn't have a substantial Sinn Féin presence. And the residents groups, I think, reflect that in the composition of their groups. Now, Sinn Féin's role, and this is where I take issue with this programme, we have a situation shaping up. At the end of this month, the marching season begins. Recently, in the past week, there have been sounds that the Orange leaders were prepared to engage in negotiations. This programme, I believe, has blown that prospect out of the water. And this programme, I think, will have to take some responsibility if we have a rerun of Drumcree this year again. There was a possibility of the desired objective, Sinn Féin's and the residents' groups.
Okay, let me back in for a minute, Mr. McLaughlin. Shouldn't Sinn Féin take responsibility if you and your activists for 3 years have exploited the genuine grievances of nationalists in the North to provoke that kind of situation we saw in Drumcree? Isn't that irresponsible?
Absolutely, yes, if that was the case. But if Sinn Féin's role as a constructive part of the protests against Orange supremacy was bringing us to the point of negotiations and a peaceful outcome, was that not a legitimate and a desired outcome?
But it wasn't a peaceful outcome, Mr. McLaughlin, was it?
Did we have a situation where the leader of the Orange Order last week was advising negotiations? And is that not precisely what Sinn Féin have been asking for the past number of years?
What do you believe should happen now? Do you believe there should be mediation, negotiation, or how is Sinn Féin? Are you going to send your activists back out in July to continue your orchestration and your protest?
I refute that we ever sent our activists out. Our activists belong in the community. They're active within their communities. And if the community groups that emerge reflect the reality of Sinn Féin's presence within the groups, I am not going to apologise for that under any circumstances. What I would say to you is this programme is a disgrace, and this programme has sabotaged the very real possibility that we could have avoided Drumcree 3 through a process of local negotiation. Okay. And I think those who designed this programme have a lot to answer for.
Okay, Mr. McLaughlin, thank you very much for joining us. Brendan O'Brien, briefly, because we don't have much time, you were one of the 2 primetime journalists who got access to this Gerry Adams speech. Both Mr. McLaughlin and Sinn Féin also today said it's a matter of interpretation. Is it a matter of interpretation?
Well, the situation really is, without playing with words, that Gerry Adams said that the situation that existed in Drumcree and those other areas he named is one that Sinn Féin should exploit. Now, the word exploit there is, in the circumstances of the North, quite an explosive word. Now, it should be said that Gerry Adams' speech was in the context where he and the leadership of Sinn Féin were coming under quite considerable pressure from their own people at this private conference because they felt that they weren't achieving enough. And he was also spelling out that they were under pressure not to give way to IRA demands. So he was under pressure from a number of sides. And what he was really doing here was telling the faithful that work had been done, that they weren't sitting on their hands, and that they had been in there developing, creating, if you like, exploiting, if you like, using his own words, the situation of confrontation that had existed.
Okay, Brendan, we have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us.